Her limbs had gone numb, her breaths shallow. The only indication that she was still alive was the faint rise and fall of her frail chest. Her belly, pregnant with puppies, lay on the ice-choked earth, sucking what tattered remnants of warmth pooled in her. She had attempted to seek refuge. She had been wandering, limping between the deserted streets, looking for somewhere to hide from the never-ending cold. But she hadn't had any doors opened for her. No benevolent hands had extended. Story comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. She had been invisible. Her golden, soft fur was clumped and frozen stiff. The little lives inside her stirred, but her body was too weak to react. No one was coming. The city was pulsing around her, folk racing by, cars honking in the distance, laughter pouring from warm homes. But none of it mattered. She had become an afterthought, thrown away and forgotten. And then, footsteps. They started off at a distance, muffled by the plump coffin of snow. Then they got louder, closer. She wanted to raise her head to see who was coming, but even that required too much effort. The steps slowed, stopped. A shadow loomed over her. She braced herself. Would they kick her, yell at her to leave, or worse, leave like everyone else? But then something surprising happened. A voice, soft and insistent, called out through the frigid night. "Oh, no, you poor thing." Two hands reached down and wiped the ice from her fur. She recoiled from the touch but felt no pain, no roughness, only warmth. The stranger knelt beside her, their breath fogging the frozen air. It was the first time in days that she felt anything other than despair. But was it too late? Her body was failing. Her puppies were coming, and time was running out. She lay in the snow, still, her breath slow and shallow. Intermittently, a frail quaking would pass through her bony astride, as though her body was still resisting, refusing to relent. But the stranger could see it in her dull, half-closed eyes. She was running out of time. "Come on, girl. You've got to hold on." His voice faltered as he stretched his hand out again, placing it softly on her swollen abdomen. His heart raced as he sensed movement, the little kicks of a life still fighting inside her. She wasn't the only one in this fight. The stranger looked around desperately. The streets were nearly deserted, even the usual late-night let-outs chased away by the cold. No nearby shelters, no open shops, only rows of locked doors and shuttered windows. No one was going to help. If he left now, she wouldn't survive the night. He swallowed hard. He hadn't planned for this. He had been returning home, like so many tired other nights after work. But there was something about this moment, this fragile, dying mother-to-be, that resonated deep inside him. He couldn't just leave. He wouldn't. Slowly, he took off his coat and draped it over her emaciated body. And even through the layers, he could feel her ribs, her frail frame clinging to life. He didn't know how long she had been out here, but it was too long. "Okay, girl, I've got you." Taking a deep breath, he slipped his arms beneath her as she stiffened, flinching as if in panic. But she didn't. She was too weak to fight. As he picked her off the frozen soil, pain coursed through her features. A faint whimper crept from her lips. Then, her body stiffened. The stranger froze. For a moment, he panicked. Had he hurt her? Was she already too far gone? Then he realized it wasn't him. Her whole body tensed, breath coming hot and shallow. A sudden quake rocked through her frame. His stomach dropped. The puppies. No, 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 not now. But it was happening. There, in the middle of the freezing street, her body was going into labor. He didn't have much time. and if he didn't move now, none would make it. Her body stiffened again, convulsing violently through her frail form. A strangled, pained whimper slipped past her lips as she pressed her face against the folds of the coat he'd draped around her. The stranger's heart pounded. He wasn't a vet. He wasn't a rescuer. He was just someone ordinary, someone who had been thrust into this moment politically, clueless. And yet, he was all she had. All right, girl, just hang on." His gaze flitted up and down the street, searching for anything, a sign, a door, a sign of life. The December night pressed in on him, jeering at his hesitation. Then, through the panic storming his mind, an idea hit. The old warehouse. It was a few blocks away, a dilapidated building long boarded up. He had driven by it dozens of times, never thinking twice about it. But at that moment, it was the only choice. He wrapped his arm around her frail form and ran, his feet smacking against the snow, his lungs expelling great blasts of breath. She gasped again every few seconds, her body writhing against his arms. He was old enough to know what was going on. She was in pain. The contractions were getting progressively more powerful. He pressed on, disregarding the fire in his legs, the bite of the frigid wind on his skin. Every second mattered. Then finally, the warehouse. Before him stood a massive door, metal and rust, coated in frost. Only pausing for a moment, he used one hand to settle her weight to one side, using his other to rip it open. It didn't budge. No, come on. He plunged his shoulder into it. Once, twice. It yielded on the third try, with a groaning screech of rusted hinges. Once they were in, the wind was stilled. The bitter cold still hung in the air, but at least here they were protected. "Okay, girl, I got you. We're safe now." Safe. But was that really true? The room was dim, filled with dust-filled air. Decrepit wooden crates lay strewn across the floor, and in a far corner, shards of glass caught what little moonlight leaked between the boarded-up windows. It wasn't much, but it was better than out there. Moving fast, he looked around and saw an old stack of burlap sacks. It wasn't hatchbacks, but it was as close as he could get to warmth for her. All right, easy now. He knelt and lovingly lowered her onto the makeshift bed. As soon as her body hit the sacks, she took a deep, strained breath. Her entire body shook as she shrank up, her muscles clenching with another contraction. It was happening. Not time to run, no way to get help. It was just him and her now. And if he didn't act quickly, she wouldn't survive this alone. The stranger knelt beside her, heart speeding. He felt panic creeping in his chest, but he willed himself to remain calm. She needed him to be strong. Another contraction ripped through her and she moaned sharply this time. She was spent, a spindly thing barely hanging on. Her pain-clouded eyes flickered towards him, as if pleading for help. "Come on, girl, you can do this," he whispered, shaking hands gently cradling her swollen belly. He had never delivered puppies before, but in this moment he had no option. He hastily took off his scarf and placed it on the ground. If a puppy was born very weak, it would require warmth immediately. Another contraction ripped through the dog and she let out a deep, guttural cry, then movement. His throat constricted when he saw it. A tiny head emerging. Oh my God, it's happening. His hands hovered in uncertainty. Should he help? Should he simply let nature take its course? He didn't know what he was doing, but he knew one thing. This mother couldn't do this alone. With steady hands, he reached out, gently ushering the tiny, slick body into the world. The puppy was limp, too still. His stomach clenched. Was it alive? "Come on, little one." He quickly rubbed the pup with the edge of his scarf, trying to bring it around. Seconds felt like hours. Then a tiny gasp, a weak, delicate squeak. It was breathing. Yes! He laid the newborn next to its mother, but she was too tired to care. Her eyes hardly opened at all. She was struggling, and it wasn't over yet. Another contraction seized her, her thin body convulsing violently. He sensed it. There were more puppies ahead, but she was getting weaker. "No, no, no. Come on, stay with me, girl. You can't give up now." Her breathing was ragged. Each attempt seemed to sap the little energy she had left. She was fighting, but that wasn't enough. If something didn't happen soon, she wasn't going to make it. And that's when he knew he had to find help. He somehow had to get her through this, even at the cost of losing everything. The stranger gritted his teeth, struggling to keep the panic that was skittering up his ribcage at bay. This wasn't over. Another contraction ripped through her frail body, except this time, her whimpers were softer. The fight was leaving her. She didn't have the strength to bear down. "No, no, no. Don't do this, girl. Not now." He laid his hands across her belly, feeling the faint flutters under her skin. The other puppies were alive, still waiting to be born. But if she passed out now, they would all die. He had to act. He had no medical training, no experience, no tools, simply desperation and sheer will. "Stay with me. Just a little longer." His fingers trembled as he worked lightly on her stomach with just enough pressure to aid her body in doing something it was too weak to do alone. He didn't know if this would work, but he couldn't just stand there and watch her die. Time stretched for seconds into infinity. Then a shift. A whole other little shape began to form. He lunged and then, heart racing, reached forward to gently ease the newborn into the world. This one was actually weaker than the first. Its little chest hardly rose and fell, its breath so weak he could hardly see it. "No, you're not giving up." With trembling hands, he did what he had seen in innumerable documentaries. He cleared its mouth, rubbed its tiny body, urged it with breath. Nothing. "Come on, baby, please." Another rub. Another desperate attempt. Then a gasp. It was a weak, trembling squeak that broke the silence. "Yes, that's it." He immediately put the pup next to its sibling. Yet there was no moment of relief, because when he glanced down at the mother, his gut twisted. She wasn't moving. Her breathing was still present, just. Her eyelids flicked apart, unfocused and far away. "No, no, no, don't do this." His hands hovered defensively over her. Here were two puppies, alive, but there were more inside, and she was too weak to bring them into the world. This wasn't enough. She needed warmth, real warmth. His eyes flickered around the warehouse, seeking anything that could help. But it was all so cold, so dead. Then it hit him. His coat, his scarf, his own body heat. He didn't hesitate. He ripped off his hoodie and then his shirt and covered the puppies in the thick fabric. Then gently, he scooped up the mother and held her against his chest. Her body was ice. "Stay with me, girl. You hear me?" The instant that he embraced her, something shifted. Her breathing, shallow and weak only moments ago, deepened slightly. For a moment, her eyes flickered with life. It wasn't much, but it was something. "I can't lose you. Not now. Not after this." He swayed a little, his arms tightening around her frail frame. He didn't care that the cold was reaching gnaws with his skin, that his own body was beginning to shake from the cold, because in this moment he was all she had, and he wasn't about to let her leave. He could feel it. The heat was draining out of her now. Her body was no longer shaking. It was becoming still, too still. No, 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 don't do this. Not now. He wrapped her tightly into him, as urgency surged beneath his skin, forcing her tighter toward his chest, as if he could push his body heat into hers, a human kettle trick. But it wasn't enough. She needed help, real help. His thoughts raced, his breath coming in short, frantic gulps. What were his options? He had no car, no way to call for help. And the closest vet clinic? Miles away. He cursed under his breath. If only he had found her sooner. If only he had been more prepared. But now it was not important. She did not care. All that mattered was saving her. All right, girl. Hold on. Just hold on. He looked one last time at the little, helpless puppies to make his decision. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to run. His muscles resisted as he swept the mother dog back into his arms, her lifeless form barely compliant. He snatched up the swaddled pups, tucking them tight to his chest. And no second of hesitation later, he took off running. Suddenly, the warehouse door slammed open and the icy wind bit into his naked skin. Snow pelted his face, but he didn't slow down. His boots beat against the pavement. His lungs burned, but he didn't care. Because with each step, her heartbeat faded. Come on, girl. Stay with me, just a little longer. The city was eerily still this late at night. Street lights stuttered in the falling snow, but the roads were bare. The houses he walked past were warm, safe, populated by people who were wholly unaware that, just outside their doors, a life was teetering on the brink. He didn't stop, couldn't stop. Then, at last, the cardboard sign aglow. A gas station. It wasn't a vet, it wasn't a shelter, but it was open. And at the moment, it was his only chance. His breath came out in ragged gasps, and his legs burned as he pushed forward. A gas station sign buzzed neon above, casting a sick light onto the parking lot. He pounded his fist against the glass door. Help! I need help! The attendant inside, a middle-aged man with sleepy eyes, looked up in shock. For a second, he just stared. Then, as he looked upon the half-frozen man holding a dying dog and a sack of barely living puppies, his face changed. He grabbed the phone. Yeah, I need a vet. Right now. The stranger's chest was rising and falling, his arms sore from hauling the dog. He could feel the seconds passing him by. Please, hurry! And when the first wailing sirens pierced the nighttime calm, he prayed it wasn't too late. The mother dog barely moved. Her breaths were so shallow by now he had to press his hand against her fragile body just to feel them. The two tiny puppies, bundled tightly inside his hoodie, let out soft whimpers, but at least they weren't dead. That was what held him together, what prevented him from collapsing. What? Come on, just hang in there a little bit. Then, the screech of tires. A dark SUV wheeled into the parking lot, skidding a little on the icy pavement before stopping. The passenger door swung open, and a woman in scrubs pushed herself out, a medical bag in tow. Where is she? Here. His voice broke as he rushed up to it, stretching out the mother dog with shaking hands. The woman, a vet, or at least someone who knew what they were doing, took one look at the dog and went directly into action. She's in shock. We need to warm her up. Fast. She looked back at the gas station attendant who remained frozen in the doorway. I need towels, blankets, anything warm. Now. The man shook off his stupor and ran inside, behind the aisles. The vet gingerly lifted the mother dog from the stranger's arms, placing her onto the back seat of the SUV. She acted fast, bundling her with a thick thermal blanket, then withdrawing a syringe and sticking a needle into the dog's frail, raw skin. She's dangerously dehydrated. We've got fluids we've got to get into her now, or she won't survive. The stranger could hardly hear her. His gaze was fixed on the mother dog's face, seeking any indication that she was still in the fight. Her eyelids flickered. A good sign, but not enough. "She's not out of the woods yet," the vet said, fiddling with the IV bag. Then another sound, a tiny squeak. The puppies. He pulled off his hoodie to display the 2 tiny newborns wrapped inside. They were alive, but their bodies were frozen. The vet's eyes widened. "We have to get them warm, right now." She reached out for them, but the stranger reflexively held them tight to his chest. "No, wait, I can do it." There was authority in his voice even through fatigue. He had brought them this far. He wasn't letting go now. The vet paused only a beat before nodding. "Keeping them close to your skin, that's their best chance." Nodding, he pressed them lightly to his bare breast and wrapped his coat tightly around them. The little beats of their hearts were so quiet, so fragile. "I'm not letting you go," he whispered. The vet recommenced her focus on the mama dog. Her breathing was still shallow, but now, cocooned in warmth, it was only slightly deeper. It wasn't enough. But it was something. "We have to get her to the clinic, now." The stranger didn't hesitate. Then he climbed into the SUV without a thought, the puppies in his arms. As the car dashed into the night, snow flurrying by outside the windows, he knew it. A spark of hope. They weren't safe yet. But for the first time since this nightmare began, it actually felt like they had a chance. Hands moved fast. The vet adjusting the IV bag dangling from the car's ceiling. Hands checking the mother dog's pulse. Hands pressing fingers gently against ribs covered in fur, barely expanding and contracting. "Her temperature is still too low," she muttered to herself, her eyes darting nervously about the road in front. The man gulped, his heart racing. He didn't need a medical degree to understand what that meant. She was fading. How much longer? His voice was hoarse, strained. 10 minutes. That's too long. The vet didn't respond. Perhaps because she sensed that he was correct. Perhaps because she knew they couldn't fix it. He looked down at the small, helpless puppies clutched against him. Their breaths were shallow but regular. He could hear the little hearts flapping against his skin. "Keep fighting, little ones. You're almost there." Then suddenly, a sharp intake of breath. His gaze shifted to the mother dog. Her body quaked violently, her muscles tightening for an instant, eviscerating moment, before going slack again. What was that? The vet had whirled around, her hands flying to the dog's side. "No, no, no, don't do this to me." She reached into her bag and withdrew another syringe, her hands quick yet steady. The stranger could see it now, the urgency in her eyes, the way her fingers trembled just a little bit. "She's crashing." His stomach clenched. "Do something." "I'm trying." The needle pricked the dog's skin, injecting a surge of adrenaline directly into her bloodstream. The stranger caught his breath, fingers curling maliciously into his coat. Seconds passed. Nothing. Then a twitch, a sluggish, almost cacophonic twiddle of movement in her paws, a ragged, shaky inhale. She was still here. Barely, but still here. "She's fighting," the vet said softly under the circumstances. The stranger felt tears well in his eyes, for a reason he hadn't even realized he carried, and he gasped with pleasure at the burn of tears. "Come on, girl. You're this far already." The car rounded a corner quickly, its tires squeaking but quickly finding purchase on the asphalt. Down the way, bright red neon letters glowed in the night. 24-hour animal clinic. They had made it. And the fight was far from over. The SUV slid to a stop before the emergency doors. Before the car had even come to a complete stop, The vet had pushed the door open. "Go, get those puppies in right now." The stranger didn't hesitate. He couldn't take her with him in the car, so holding on tight to the little pups, he jumped out and ran after the vet as she carried the mother dog through the clinic doors. The emergency room was sterile, bright lights spilling over everything in a harsh glow. A group of vet technicians dashing toward him, overlapping voices already springing into motion. "She's in shock. I haven't got a warming unit. Stat. Her oxygen levels are critical. Hook her up." The stranger froze in the doorway, panting, his chest rising and falling in quick bursts. It was out of his hands now. As the team at the clinic scrambled frantically, he collapsed into one of the waiting room chairs, still holding the puppies to his chest. He ran trembling fingers over their soft, hardly there fur. "Please, just make it." The minutes felt like hours stretching into moments. Then, at last, the vet came out of the emergency room, ripping off her gloves with a weary sigh. She met his gaze, and for the first time all evening, she smiled. She's not out of the woods yet. Her voice was low but steady, but she's alive. The weight in his chest lifted so suddenly, so sharply that he was forced to let out a shaky breath just to make sense of it. Alive. They had made it. And for the first time, staring down at the tiny puppies in his arms, he knew he wasn't just saving them. They had saved him too. The mother dog was still alive, barely. The vet had made that clear. She wasn't out of danger yet. Her body had been pushed to its limits, severely malnourished, dangerously dehydrated, and still weak from labor. If her body shut down now, there was nothing else they could do. He took a shaky breath, dragging a hand the length of his face. He had done all he could do. But was it enough? He looked down at the two little puppies, their soft whimpers barely perceptible. Their eyes hadn't yet opened. Tiny, delicate paws twitched in sympathy with the small baby squirming against the warmth of his chest. They were fragile. So fragile. Would they survive the night at all? The thought made his throat constrict. He had never thought of himself as a hero. He was simply a regular guy who had found a desperate man on the verge of death. But now his life was tethered to theirs, and it was a burden he had never borne. "Sir?" The soft voice startled him. He looked up to find the vet standing over him, her face a mixture of fatigue and tentative hope. "She's stable for the moment," she said, her voice low, cautious, "but she's very weak. We're doing everything possible, but the next 24 hours are crucial." His fingertips curled slightly in the wool of his coat. "And the puppies?" The vet paused, looking down at the tiny bundles in his arms. "They require care 24/7. Their mother isn't producing milk yet. Her body is too weak. They won't survive if they don't eat soon." His stomach twisted. "So, what do we do?" "We hand-feed them," she said matter-of-factly, gesturing to a small box behind her. It was filled with small bottles containing a special formula. Every 2 hours, no exceptions. The weight of her words fell on him. Every 2 hours, no sleep, no breaks. It is just a never-ending struggle to keep them alive. He could see the weariness in the vet's eyes. She had been running on adrenaline for hours, too, like him. And now, it was his move to step up. "I'll do it," he said, before he could second-guess himself. The vet gazed at him for a long moment. "Are you sure? It's a big responsibility. I did not come this far to give up here." Something in his voice must have dissuaded her because she nodded. "All right, let's get started." Then, a few hours later, the stranger is seated in a quiet room, cradling one of the little puppies in his hands while feeding it from a bottle. The suckling starts weakly, then grows stronger. A glimmer of hope ignites in his breast. They were fighting. They weren't in the clear yet, not by a long shot. But as the first puppy completed its feeding, its small body curling against his hand in exhaustion, he dared to believe perhaps they had a chance after all. The vet had said the first 24 hours were crucial. If the puppies didn't eat, if their mother's body never began to heal, if the cold had done too much damage, none would survive. So he didn't sleep. He couldn't. So he sat in that room, monitoring them, fed the puppies every couple of hours, as the vet had instructed. His fingers wavered a little around the tiny bottle as he delicately squeezed drops of warm formula. "Come on, little one, just a little more." The puppy woke up, its little tongue poking out and grabbing the bottle once more. Weakness, but it was at least trying. And that was all it took for him to march on. He had a furtive eye on the mother dog. She hadn't done much moving since they got there. The monitors beeped steadily, but her body was still too delicate. She was fighting, but barely. All of it settled heavily in mounds upon his shoulders and melted him down. "Am I even doing this right?" he whispered to himself. He had never cared for a dog in his life, much less a mother on the verge of death and her 2 newborns, which depended on him to save their lives. But he was here, and he wasn't giving up. Time lapse. Hours pass. The camera pans to a clock on the wall, watching the hands tick forward slowly as the hours drag on. The stranger shifts uneasily, and exhaustion visibly weighs down his demeanor. His eyes blink closed for a moment and then fly open as a quiet whimper echoes in his ears. His heart clenched. It wasn't from the puppies. It was from her. The mother dog shifted slightly, brushing her body against the blankets. She raised her head for the first time in hours, just a little. Her dark eyes, weak yet filled with some feeling he'd never seen, focused on the small bundles next to him. She was awake. "Hey there, girl." He spoke hardly above a whisper, as though raising his voice would frighten her back into unconsciousness. She didn't respond. Not fully. But those puppies were where her eyes didn't leave. Then, her nose twitched. She was trying to move. She was trying to reach them. His chest tightened. She had almost died. Her body was close to giving up. And yet she was in battle mode, fighting to be with her babies. He paused only a second, then gingerly scooped one of the puppies and placed it next to her nose. The instant the little animal made contact with her fur, she unleashed the softest, most frail whimper he had ever witnessed. And suddenly, the fatigue in his bones, the doubt in his mind, the fear that had gnawed at him all night, it all faded. Because this was no longer just about survival. This was about family. It was the longest night of his life. A night of furious feeding, of whispered, "You can do it," of hoping against hope they will hang on. He hadn't eaten much, hadn't moved much, hadn't let himself breathe much, fearful that if he loosened up, even for a second, he'd lose them. But now, with the first light of morning creeping into the room, something was different. The mother dog, who had been drifting in and out of consciousness just hours before, was alert. Her actions were slow, weak, hunting. She was aware. And when she looked at him, really looked at him, something in her eyes had shifted. She wasn't afraid anymore. She trusted him. "Morning, girl," he said, a tiny, tired smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Her ears twitched slightly. It was a little, but it was a lot. Time lapse, later that morning. The vet comes through the door, her face inscrutable. She goes to the mother dog kneeling next to her to check her vitals. The stranger straightened up, his gut in knots at the thought. "How is she?" The vet exhaled slowly, then nodded. She is still critical, but she is stable. We expected her to not make it through the night. She did, and that's more than we expected. His chest tightened. Stable. She had a chance. She's responding well to fluids, and her body seems to be bouncing back, the vet added, laying a hand on the dog's side. But she's not out of danger yet. The stranger swallowed hard. What else can we do? The vet glanced at the two tiny puppies still curled up in his arms. They require their mother's milk. Formula is assisting, but in the long term, it's not going to cut it. She cast a glance back at the mother dog, her brow knitted with concern. She needs to start feeding them. But at the moment, she is too weak to have milk. The words struck him like a punch in the gut. So, what does that mean? So, it means she needs nutrition, real food, warmth, rest. If she gathers enough strength, her body may heal. But if not, the sentence paused in the air, unlooped. He knew what she meant. The puppies weren't going to survive either, if the mother didn't find her strength soon. It was like a domino effect. They were all connected. "Whatever it takes," he said fiercely, gripping the small bundles in his arms. The vet looked him over for a long minute before nodding. "All right, let's give her a fighting chance." Montage. Over the next several hours, the stranger tends to the mother dog and her puppies. He spoon-feeds her soft food, gently encouraging her to take small bites. He massages her thin legs, promoting circulation. He continues to bottle-feed the puppies every 2 hours, never having missed a feeding. The vet looks on from a distance, impressed by his work ethic. He was exhausted. His body ached. His lids weighed 100 pounds themselves. But he didn't stop, because every last breath that they drew, every last flicker of life, was worth it. And then, finally, something amazing happened. The mother dog shifted. Gradually, one position at a time, the paper said. She hoisted herself enough to sniff at her puppies. The stranger froze, breath locked in his throat. "Come on, girl." One of them rubbed against her nose. A soft, broken whimper slipped from her throat. Then she licked them, just once, then again. His chest tightened. That's it. That's it. She wasn't just surviving. She was remembering. She was remembering why she was fighting. And for the first time, the stranger let himself believe the Fed just wasn't going to break them all. The stranger sat next to her, his limbs heavy with fatigue, but he didn't care. He had spent the last 24 hours ensuring she survived, hand-feeding the puppies, warming them. It had been a war of attrition, but perhaps, just perhaps, they were on the winning side. He held a small spoon of soft food toward the mother dog, slowly, tentatively. "Come on, girl, just a little more." She sniffed at it, paused, then she ate. His chest constricted and loosened with relief. "That's it. That's my girl." The veterinarian, who had been observing from the doorway, let out a small, approving sigh. "She's starting to eat again. That's a very good sign." Yet even as the relief enveloped him, one last hurdle remained. She had puppies to nurse. He had been bottle-feeding them non-stop, but the vet had warned him, formula can go only so far. The milk from the mother held critical nutrients that no man-made replacement could replicate. And now that she was growing stronger, it was time to see whether she would accept them. The mysterious stranger felt a quickening of his pulse. "Do you think she's ready?" he asked hesitantly. The vet nodded. There's only one way to know. Time lapse. The stranger and the vet gently create a warm, small nest with blankets and soft towels. They delicately place the puppies next to their mother, still so small and fragile. For a beat, She doesn't respond. She just watches them, as if not knowing what to do. The stranger held his breath. The pups wriggled toward her, instinct propelling them, their tiny bodies huddled against her fur, their small noses rifling for warmth. The mother dog gave a slight, shaky exhale, and then she moved. She turned and twisted her body, slowly, tentatively, until she got into the right position for them to hold on. The first puppy pressed in closer, then the second. A heartbeat of silence elapsed. Then, the first tiny suckle, followed by another, and another. The stranger exhaled, releasing a breath he didn't even know he'd been holding. "She's feeding them," the vet murmured, as if incredulous. He couldn't speak. He could only watch as the mother dog, this abandoned, near-frozen creature, took up her task once more. She had just been on the verge of dying. They'd discarded her, abandoned her to freeze. But now she was fighting for more than herself. "Now, she's not just surviving," the stranger whispered. "She's living." And for the first time in days, his face broke into a smile. Because after all they'd been through, after all the uncertainty, all the fear, they had made it. The stranger sat beside them, his body heavy with fatigue, but his heart lighter than it had been in days. For the last few nights he'd been fighting for them, keeping them warm, hand-feeding them, praying they would survive. And now she was doing it herself. She had stopped merely surviving. She was protecting them. "She's doing well," the vet said gently, moving closer to him. He nodded, unable to draw away from the small, tender family before him. "I didn't know if we'd find our way here," he said. The vet smiled knowingly at him. The majority of people would not have survived this long. The gravity of that statement fell upon him heavier than he had anticipated. The average person would have caved. Very few people would have stopped in the bitter cold and snow, would have carried her through the night, would have sat up for endless hours, feeding tiny babies by mouth, just to give them a chance. But he had. And now, as he watched the mother quietly lick her newborns, the faintest whimper of contentment escaping her throat, he knew it had all been worth it. Time lapse later that day. The stranger helps feed the mother dog, gently placing a bowl of soft food next to her. She takes her time eating, but makes progress. Her body is still weak, her ribs still visible, but her spirit is stronger. Every little progress seems like a win. "She's still got a long way to go," the vet told him. "I know. You don't have to do this, you know. You've already done more than enough." He glanced at her, then back at the mother dog, this once fractured being who had fought against the odds. "I know," he repeated, "but I want to." The vet looked at him for a beat, then just nodded. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't about saving a dog anymore. It was a matter of giving her a future. And, as the stranger's hand reached farther, gliding gently along her back, he made another discovery. She wasn't just his charge anymore. She was his family. The man watched the window, arms crossed, with all sorts of doubts running through his brain. For the first time in days, he wasn't trying to keep them alive. But now, he was in a different fight. What happened next? The vet came up beside him, her face expressionless. "She's stable now. She needs some care still, but if we keep going like this, she'll be ready for adoption soon." The words hit him harder than he thought. Adoption. That was the plan from the beginning, right? Get her past the worst of it, ensure that she and her puppies lived, then place them all in good homes. At least, that's what he told himself. But now he wasn't so sure. "You've done more for her than anyone could ever do for her," the vet said, sensing his hesitation. Any other person would have not made it this far. Most people. But he wasn't most people. He had walked with her through the cold night. He stayed awake to feed her puppies by hand. He had advocated for them when others would not. How could he just turn around and walk away now? He faced the mother dog, which was nudging her puppies closer, her breath deep and measured. She was safe now. She had no more reason to fight. But deep down, he knew. She was waiting for him to make a decision. Did he let her go? Faith that someone else would care for her as she ought to be cared? Or did he own up to the life he had struggled so hard to save? The vet's voice pulled him from his reverie. If you take her on, you should know. She really trusts you. And that kind of bond doesn't come around every day. His heart clenched, because deep down he knew she was right. Not just that he had saved her. She had saved him too. And then he was no longer uncertain. He knew precisely what he needed to do. I want her, he said firmly. The vet smiled. I thought you might. He had made up his mind. He wasn't leaving her. He wasn't abandoning any of them. For days, he had struggled to keep them alive, digging deep through exhaustion, fear, and uncertainty. But somewhere along the way, without noticing, they had become his. Not just strays, not just survivors, his family. You really sure about this? The vet said from the doorway, arms crossed, a small smile pulling at her lips. Yeah, he said quietly, gazing down at the mother dog. She raised her head just enough for their two weary but trusting gazes to meet. I'm sure. So, the stranger signs away the adoption papers. The pen in his hand feels heavier than he anticipated. Not from uncertainty, but from the crushing weight of what this moment represents. This isn't just a promise. This is forever. The vet passes him a blue collar the size of a quarter. She's all yours. He swallows hard and kneels before her, deftly looping the collar around her throat. What do you think, girl? You ready to go home? For a beat, she simply stares at him. Then she licks his hand, not out of hunger, not out of fear, but out of trust. Yeah, he gasps, a small, weary smile cracking through. Me too. Final scene. The clinic doors burst open. The stranger steps outside, inhales with the crisp morning air. Beside him walks the mother dog, her steps slow and steady. Her puppies are swaddled in a soft carrier, snoozing away. The city is just waking up. The world is moving on as if nothing extraordinary happened. But to him, everything had changed. This was not how he had envisioned things going. He had not hoped to find her. He hadn't anticipated needing her so badly as she had needed him. But now, entering the unknown together, he knew one thing for sure. Neither of them would be alone ever again. The mother dog reached the sidewalk, each step hesitating, the stranger leaning against his own car watching. She was still recovering, still thin, but she no longer appeared lost. She looked found. She turned back toward him as if to say, "We're really doing this." He bent down on one knee, softly tapping his chest. "Come here, girl." For a moment, she hesitated. Then she ran. Not out of fear, not out of desperation, but because she finally had someone to run to. She jumped into his arms, tail wagging for the first time she'd known him. He laughed, the sound cutting through the early morning quiet. She was safe. She was his. Okay, he laughed as he scratched behind her ears. Let's go home. Time lapse. The drive home. The mother dog sits in the front passenger seat, head resting against the window, viewing the world go by. The small puppies in the back seat are curled up in a blanket, sound asleep. I was thinking we need to give you a name, he said, looking over at her. She twitched an ear but didn't turn from the window. something strong, something that fits. He paused, then broke into a smirk. How about hope? Her ears perked slightly. Yeah, I like that. Hope, because that was what she had given him. Final scene, a cozy home, a warm bed, the sound of a fire crackling in the corner. Hope, the mother dog, curled up with her puppies at last, at peace. The stranger, arms crossed, stands leaning against the doorframe, lips playing at a soft smile. She had been an abandoned stray, lost and alone. Now she was family. Now she was home. And as he sat next to her, softly stroking her fur, he knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning.